At 2:13 in the morning on October 3, 1889, a laborer named Thomas Keene drove the iron edge of his shovel into something that should not have been beneath downtown Chicago. The worksite stood near the commercial heart of the city, where new buildings were rising faster than old ones could be remembered. Chicago was still a city in motion, still rebuilding, still lifting itself out of mud, ash, and ambition. At that hour, the street above was almost empty. A few wagons moved in the dark. Gas lamps trembled in the wind. Below street level, inside a rectangular excavation cut for the foundation of a new commercial building, 11 men worked under lantern light. They had been hired to dig deep. Chicago's soil was unstable. Heavy buildings required stubborn foundations, and by the late 1880s, the city's builders were learning how to anchor modern ambition into wet ground. The men expected to find clay, rubble, old brick, perhaps remnants of burned structures left from the Great Fire of 1871. That was normal. In Chicago, almost every deep excavation became a conversation with the city's buried past. But what Keene struck was not loose rubble. The sound was sharp, flat, and wrong. One of the foremen, a man named Patrick Doyle, reportedly climbed down into the pit and ordered the workers to clear the earth by hand. They scraped away mud and debris until the lanterns revealed the edge of a stone slab. It was not broken. It was not random. It appeared cut, fitted, and set into the ground with deliberate precision. The slab was nearly 6 feet wide, dark with moisture, and joined to another stone beside it so tightly that the men first mistook the seam for a crack. Then they found a ring. Not an iron construction ring. Not a pipe fitting. A recessed metal loop set into the stone as if the slab had been designed to open. For several minutes, no one spoke. Then Doyle ordered 2 men to bring crowbars. The slab did not lift easily. The suction of damp earth held it down, and the sound it made when it finally shifted was described by one worker as like a cellar door opening under a grave. Beneath it was not empty soil. It was a stairway. A narrow stone stairway descended into darkness below the level where any cellar, vault, or post-fire foundation should have existed. Thomas Keene lowered a lantern into the opening. The light dropped down the first few steps, caught the edge of a wall, and revealed markings carved into the stone. Not names. Not initials. Not construction marks. Geometric figures. Repeated lines. Circles divided by straight bars. Small square depressions arranged in rows. And, just beyond the third step, something pale lying against the wall. At first, the men thought it was a piece of plaster. Then one of them said it looked like bone. By sunrise, the opening was gone. The foundation pit had been partially refilled. The workers had been dismissed. A municipal wagon had come and gone before most of the city woke. And the building project resumed within days, with no public report, no excavation notice, and no preserved record explaining what had been uncovered beneath the 1889 Chicago foundation. This is the case that remains almost impossible to settle. Not because there is no story, but because the story seems to have been removed from the place where a normal city would have recorded it. If the event was only a construction accident, why was the pit covered before daylight? If the discovery was only an old cellar, why did workers describe a stone chamber below the known building layers? And if nothing important had been found, why did the paper trail around that specific foundation become so thin exactly where it should have become detailed? To understand why the discovery mattered, we have to return to the Chicago that existed in 1889. It was not the polished skyline people imagine today. It was a restless city, rebuilt in a hurry after catastrophe. 18 years earlier, in October of 1871, fire had torn through Chicago and left thousands of buildings destroyed. The city did not simply repair itself. It reinvented itself. Streets were regraded. Lots were cleared. Foundations were dug through layers of ash, brick, timber, clay, and older structures that nobody had fully mapped. Chicago became famous for building upward, but before it could rise, it had to deal with what was underneath. The city had already performed one of the strangest engineering transformations in American urban history. It had raised streets and buildings to improve drainage. Entire blocks had been lifted. New layers were placed over old ones. Basements became sub-basements. Ground floors became cellars. The boundary between original ground and constructed ground blurred. In some places, what appeared to be street level was already a manufactured surface laid over an earlier city. That made Chicago a city of vertical memory. Above ground, steel, brick, and commerce. Below ground, older foundations, forgotten passageways, drainage works, service tunnels, buried debris, and possibly things that had been there before the city had a language for them. The official explanation for strange finds in those years was usually simple: post-fire rubble, old cellar, drainage feature, abandoned utility, nothing more. Most of the time, that explanation was probably correct. But the foundation discovery of October 1889 does not fit comfortably into that pattern. The first surviving reference appears not in a major newspaper report, but in a private construction memorandum later described by a clerk who had worked for a firm involved in foundation contracts near the commercial district. The memorandum allegedly noted a temporary obstruction caused by subsurface masonry of unknown origin. That phrase is bureaucratic, dry, and easy to overlook. But it contains a problem. Unknown origin. Builders in Chicago knew what old cellars looked like. They knew the difference between burned brick, limestone foundation blocks, sewer work, and drainage construction. If the obstruction had been routine, there would have been no reason to describe it as unknown. A second reference appears in a payroll interruption. The crew assigned to the excavation was paid for a partial night shift and then reassigned for 2 days before returning to the same site. That is unusual, but not by itself suspicious. Work stoppages happened. Weather, water, inspections, and supply delays could all interrupt a foundation dig. But the timing matters. The reassignment came immediately after the reported discovery. And when the crew returned, they were no longer assigned to deepen the central pit. Instead, they were instructed to reinforce the perimeter and proceed with fill preparation. In other words, after finding something below the foundation, the project shifted away from exploring downward and toward sealing the site into the new construction. A third fragment is more direct. It comes from an account attributed to a night watchman named Samuel Briggs, who reportedly told a local acquaintance years later that city men arrived before dawn and ordered the workers away from the opening. Briggs claimed they brought canvas, boards, and 2 heavy crates. He did not know what was removed, if anything. He only remembered that the men were not from the construction company. They wore city badges. According to the account, one of them entered the excavation, looked down into the opening, and said, "Cover it before the street sees it." That sentence has never been verified through an official transcript. It survives only as recollection. But it became the core of the case because it explains the most unusual part of the story: the urgency. Cities do not usually cover harmless objects before sunrise. They document them, inspect them, assign blame, delay construction, or ignore them. But they do not usually send representatives into a private foundation pit in the middle of the night unless something in that pit creates risk beyond engineering. So what did the workers actually see? The most consistent version describes a chamber beneath the slab, reached by a narrow stairway. The chamber was not large, perhaps 12 to 15 feet across, with a low ceiling and stone walls darkened by age and damp. The masonry was unlike the brickwork commonly used in Chicago commercial basements. It was described as fitted stone, with surfaces too regular to be natural, but too unfamiliar to be easily classified by the men who saw it. The markings were the detail that disturbed them most. Several workers reportedly described repeated geometric carvings along the wall. Circles cut with straight lines, small squares arranged in grids, and a vertical symbol resembling a ladder or track. One man compared them to survey marks. Another said they looked like machinery drawn by someone who did not know machines. That phrase, if accurately preserved, is strange enough to matter. It suggests the markings did not appear decorative. They seemed functional, but not in a way the workers understood. Then there were the bones. No complete skeleton was ever described, only partial remains. A long bone. Fragments near the wall. Something that might have been a jaw or might have been stone. The reports are inconsistent, and that inconsistency is important. Men seeing bones by lantern light in a muddy chamber could easily mistake debris for human remains. But they also could have seen something real and later softened the description out of fear, pressure, or uncertainty. One detail appears in more than one version. The bones were not lying in a coffin, not arranged like a burial, and not associated with any known cemetery record. That created a legal problem. If human remains were found during construction, the city should have been notified, the site should have been inspected, and a report should have been created. If the remains belonged to a known burial ground, that would have triggered a different process. If they were older, unidentified, or associated with artifacts, the matter could have become much more complicated. But no clear public report exists. That absence is one of the strongest pieces of the mystery. Not proof of an ancient chamber. Not proof of a suppressed civilization. But proof of a gap where documentation should be. When investigators later tried to reconstruct the site through maps, they found another problem. The lot records and fire insurance maps showed previous structures in the area, but none appeared to account for a stone chamber at the reported depth. Older basements were possible. Hidden vaults were possible. Chicago had businesses, storage rooms, and buried utility spaces that did not always appear on public maps. But the depth described by the workers placed the chamber below the ordinary level of known commercial cellars. And the slab itself was wrong. A cellar would usually have an entrance from a building footprint. A vault would have access from a street or basement. A drainage structure would connect to a system. But the stone slab with a recessed ring suggested a sealed access point from above, intentionally hidden beneath layers of fill. It was not just underground. It was covered. That distinction changes the investigation. The next question becomes whether the chamber was built by Chicagoans before the fire, by earlier settlers, by an industrial operation that left no ordinary record, or by someone whose work predated the known urban layout. The official explanation, when one is inferred from later references, seems to have been that the structure was an undocumented pre-fire cellar. Chicago was full of them. The Great Fire destroyed records, altered property boundaries, and left many structures buried or obscured. A forgotten cellar under a lot near the commercial district would not be extraordinary. But the cellar explanation fails to answer several points. Why fitted stone rather than standard brick? Why a descending stair below an already deep foundation layer? Why geometric markings? Why bones without burial context? Why a city response before daylight? Why no inspection report? Why was the opening filled rather than studied? At each step, the simple explanation becomes less stable. The deeper context makes it even more complicated. In the 1880s, Chicago was not only rebuilding, it was racing toward becoming a modern metropolis. Real estate values were climbing. Investors were impatient. Delays were expensive. A discovery beneath a major construction site could threaten permits, financing, ownership claims, or public confidence. If the find suggested an old burial, unsafe ground, disputed property, or a structure not reflected in records, the simplest institutional move would have been to classify it as irrelevant and keep building. That does not require a grand conspiracy, only convenience. A city does not need to believe in hidden history to bury it. It only needs a reason to move on. But the case does not end with the one foundation. A pattern begins to emerge when similar reports from late 19th century Chicago are placed beside it. Workers digging near old commercial blocks occasionally reported sealed brick passages, unexpected stonework, buried arches, and basement levels below expected depth. Some were certainly remnants of the city's rebuilding and street-raising projects. Others were connected to drainage and freight systems. But a few were described in language that echoes the 1889 case. Unknown masonry, unlisted vault, obstruction removed, no further action. The words are never dramatic. That is what makes them useful. History often hides in dull phrases. Subsurface irregularity. Obstruction of uncertain origin. Old work encountered. Filled under direction. The repetition does not prove the chamber existed as described. But it shows that Chicago's underground was far less orderly than official maps implied. The city was not built on a blank surface. It was built on a palimpsest, with one version of Chicago written over another, then another, until nobody could say with certainty what belonged to which layer. And that raises a larger possibility. What if the 1889 discovery was not hidden because it was impossible, but because it was inconvenient? If the chamber belonged to a forgotten pre-fire structure, it exposed how incomplete the city's memory had become. If it contained human remains, it created legal and moral problems. If it contained artifacts older than expected, it challenged assumptions about what had existed beneath the commercial core before modern development. If it was connected to a broader underground network, it threatened construction, property rights, and public scrutiny. Each possibility leads to the same outcome. Cover it. Build over it. Let the new city erase the old one. The most haunting part of the case is not the chamber itself. It is the image of that night. Workers standing in a muddy pit, lanterns burning low, staring down a stairway they had uncovered by accident. For a few minutes, the past was open. Then authority arrived, the opening was closed, and the city continued upward. By morning, pedestrians may have walked past the site without noticing anything except boards, mud, and men returning to work. They could not have known that only hours earlier, beneath that same ground, a stone door had been lifted and something unexplained had been seen below the foundation. That is how urban mysteries disappear. Not in silence, exactly, but in noise. Hammering, wagons, permits, payroll, brick deliveries, investment schedules, deadlines. The machinery of progress is loud enough to drown out almost anything beneath it. There is one final inconsistency worth considering. In later versions of the story, a small metal object was supposedly removed from the chamber before it was covered. The descriptions vary. Some call it a plate, others a gear. One says it was a corroded disc with holes arranged around its edge. No object has been located. No museum accession number matches it. No city archive openly identifies such a find from that location and date. This could be the weakest part of the story, an embellishment added later to make the chamber more mysterious. Or it could be the clue that explains the urgency. Human bones could be handled quietly. An old cellar could be dismissed. Strange markings could be ignored. But an artifact that did not match the expected timeline, material culture, or construction history of the area would be harder to explain if it reached the press. Chicago in 1889 was intensely concerned with its image. It was preparing itself to stand before the world as a modern American city. Within a few years, the World's Columbian Exposition would present Chicago as a monument to progress, order, industry, and civilization. A buried anomaly in the commercial district did not fit that vision. Modern cities prefer clean origin stories. They like to say, first there was wilderness, then settlement, then fire, then rebirth, then progress. But the ground rarely agrees. The ground keeps layers. It keeps mistakes. It keeps bones. It keeps foundations of things no one meant to preserve. It keeps evidence that development would rather forget. The 1889 Chicago Foundation case remains unresolved because almost every path to certainty ends at a missing record. The original worksite has long since changed. Buildings have come and gone. Foundations have been replaced, reinforced, or destroyed. Even if the chamber once existed, it may have been crushed, incorporated into later construction, or sealed beneath layers now inaccessible. What remains is not a clean archive, but a cluster of fragments. A worker's discovery, a stone slab, a stairway, strange marks, possible bones, municipal intervention, a covered opening, and a silence where a report should be. Skeptics can reasonably argue that the story grew from an ordinary cellar find. They can argue that workers misunderstood what they saw, that later retellings exaggerated the details, and that missing records are common in a city shaped by fire, rebuilding, and constant redevelopment. That argument deserves to be heard. But even after accepting it, the central question remains. Why before sunrise? Why did the city act in the dark, before newspapers, inspectors, property owners, or curious crowds could see what had been uncovered. That is the detail that refuses to settle. Because the timing suggests fear of exposure. Not necessarily fear of the supernatural. Not necessarily fear of an impossible civilization beneath Chicago. But fear that the discovery, whatever it was, would interrupt the story the city was trying to tell about itself. A foundation is supposed to support what comes next. This one may have exposed what came before. And for a few hours in October of 1889, beneath lantern light and wet clay, Chicago's past may have opened just enough for a handful of workers to see that the city was standing on something it had never fully explained. Then the slab was covered. The pit was filled. The records thinned. And the building rose. Today, the most honest conclusion is not certainty. It is pressure. The kind of pressure that builds when too many small details lean in the same direction. A chamber where none was mapped. A municipal response where no public report followed. A discovery described as unknown, then treated as if it should never have existed. Maybe the workers found only a forgotten cellar. Maybe they found human remains from an erased burial. Maybe they found part of an older infrastructure project swallowed by the city's own reconstruction. Or maybe, beneath that 1889 foundation, they found evidence of a Chicago beneath Chicago. A layer of history too strange, too disruptive, or too costly to preserve. The question is not simply what they found under the foundation. The question is why a city built on progress decided that whatever lay below had to disappear before daylight reached it.